Mr. President, as we all know, that in the next few weeks, we're going to be faced with a decision about what to do with the debt limit. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion around here, and as well as between the White House and the congressional leadership about how best to resolve this issue. And I think what it really comes down to is a question about what's the best way to resolve a debt crisis. And I think it creates a great debate, philosophical debate, about how do we need to grow government? Do we need to shrink government? And really, Mr. President, I would argue that's kind of the defining line in this debate, is whether or not you believe that the best way out of a debt crisis is to expand and grow government, or whether you think, like I do, that we ought to make government smaller, not larger, if we're trying to figure out how to get out of this particular circumstance that we find ourselves in right now. We have a $14 trillion debt. We're going to have to increase the borrowing authority to get through the 2012 election by about $2.4 trillion. That is the rate at which our debt is growing. And I've said on the floor before that if you look at just the daily borrowing that our federal government does, it exceeds the entire budget of my state of South Dakota for a whole year. So we will borrow more in the next 24 hours here in Washington, D.C., about $4 billion, than the state of South Dakota spends in an entire year. That is the dimension of the problem that we are facing. Now, many of us believe that the best thing that we could do in order to get ourselves on a better fiscal track is to pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And frankly, I hope that we will have an opportunity to vote on just that sometime in this next week or the following week. But most states around the country, including my state of South Dakota, have a balanced budget amendment in their Constitution. So it requires them year in and year out to get their books balanced. They can't continue to spend like there's no tomorrow. They can't spend money they don't have. They live within their means. That's what most Americans have to do. That's what American businesses and families have to do. It certainly makes sense, I think, that we ought to be doing that here at the federal level. And so I would argue to my colleagues that if we look at the short-term issue, which is the debt limit vote that we have to have, we've got to figure out how are we best going to deal with that in the near term, but what are we going to do in the long term to put our country on a more sustainable fiscal footing? And I would argue that putting an imposed discipline on Congress, like an amendment to the Constitution that would require us year in and year out to balance our budget, just makes sense. It's practical, it makes economic sense, and it certainly is a discipline that's been lacking here in Washington, D.C. for some time. And if you look at the states that have made hard decisions, mine is a good example of that. They had to cut spending this year significantly to balance their budget, but at least they are doing that. They are making those hard choices and those hard decisions, and that's something that we've been putting off here for way too long. And I would point out, too, to my colleagues here that as we talk about how to get the country back on the right fiscal track, you do have to start setting priorities. Well, we're not doing that. We haven't had a budget here in now 806 days. It's been 806 days since the Democrat majority here in the Senate has allowed us to have a vote on a budget. Now, many of us believe that in order to determine how you're going to spend $3.7 trillion of America's hard-earned money, you ought to have some priorities. You ought to at least put a pathway out there about how you're going to go about spending those dollars and setting priorities for the country. Well, we're not doing that because we haven't passed a budget in 806 days. That is a fundamental responsibility that we have as leaders. The people of this country elect us to do that, and we're not doing it. And I think that is creating uncertainty. I think it's creating instability out there around the country. I met with some business owners this morning who say that in their particular industry that there are people who want to invest. They want to create jobs. They want to make capital investments, but they're long-term investments. And they don't know what's happening here. They don't know what the policies coming out of Washington are going to be with regard to taxes, spending, regulations, all those sorts of things. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty. And there was a survey that was done just recently by the United States Chamber of Commerce in which they asked small businesses about their future hiring plans. 64% of the small businesses who responded to that survey said they were not going to add to their payrolls this year. They weren't going to hire this year. Another 12% said that they were actually going to cut jobs. Why? half of the people who responded to the survey said economic uncertainty. They just flat don't know what Washington is going to do next. And you can't have that kind of uncertainty. What the markets want, what business wants, what investors want, is they want to know what the rules are going to be. They want some certainty about what's going to happen next. And the kind of uncertainty that we're creating, Mr. President, reaches beyond our shores, because I think that you look at what's happening in Europe today. They're facing a debt crisis in many of those countries. And what are the economic impacts of that? Well, if you look at the interest rates in the Eurozone, the 3-year government bond interest rates are 19.4% for Portugal, 28.9% for Greece, and 12.9% for Ireland. That is our future if we don't get our fiscal house in order. Well, what does that mean? That means that not just does the federal government have to pay more to borrow money, to pay more in higher interest costs, it also means that those interest costs, because all the interest rates in this country, whether it's for an auto loan or a home loan or a college loan, they all track with the Treasury borrowing rates. Those rates go up. That has profound implications for our economy. That means that people across this country are going to pay much higher interest rates. Small businesses are going to pay higher interest rates to borrow money. Those are real-world impacts if we don't make the right kinds of decisions here to get this spending and this borrowing under control. I would hope, Mr. President, that this debt debate, as it comes to a conclusion, and I hope it will come to a good outcome, a good result for the people of this country. It is not, we do not want to have this country in a situation where we are not making payments, where we're defaulting on our debt. But we cannot just continue this pattern of raising the borrowing authority of this country, of adding to the federal debt without doing something to get that debt under control, without doing something to reduce the amount that this federal government spends every single year. Spending at 24 to 25% of our entire economy is a trend that cannot be continued, it cannot be sustained. And we need to get back to more of a historical average where the American people, I think, want us to be. The reason that they reacted the way that they did in the last election is because they saw this government growing at a rate that made them very uncomfortable and frightened. And I think that continues to this day because, as I said before, there is uncertainty about the country's future. There is an instability that exists today. And what I heard from these business owners this morning is, we want stability. We want to know. We need some certainty about what the rules are going to be, and more importantly, it starts by having a federal government that lives within its means, that doesn't spend money that it doesn't have, and that focuses intently on getting spending and debt under control and creating favorable conditions for economic growth and job creation in this country. That doesn't happen. That does not happen by raising government revenues, by raising taxes. That happens by the federal government exercising fiscal responsibility, reducing spending, reducing debt, keeping taxes low on our job creators so that we can get people in this country back to work. That is the correct prescription for this country, Mr. President. It is a prescription that I hope the President will embrace. I can say that Republicans here in the Senate, and I would dare say Republicans in the House of Representatives as well, are prepared to meet him in working together on that challenge of reducing spending, reducing debt, and creating conditions that are favorable to economic growth and job creation and getting American people back to work. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Just the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.